Great. All right. Welcome everyone to the monthly Hydra meeting for July. We have a lot of people trickling in right now. I will just speak a little bit before we get started with the actual presentation. I'm guessing there are some of you here that that are not members of Hydra or have not heard of Hydra before. Actually got some anecdotal indication of that from some board members too, like that, mitigation is an area that we definitely have interest in, but until recently have not had as much content about. So I'm glad this presentation will kind of hopefully bring more people from that area, and we can get more people to in dialogue on that. So to that end, if you're unfamiliar, please check out indigentdefenseresearch.org. That's where, and thankfully Stephen has linked that in the chat as well. You can, there's a bunch of links there. You can join our listserv. You can look at the stuff that we have on our website. We're currently in the process of, we post publications there, but we're currently in the process of putting together kind of a publication database. You can also donate there if you want to pay the bills for the Zoom account and the website and all that. Um, and but the number one thing is go request joining the listserv, because that is really where Hydra lives, is on that listserv, and as kind of a community of knowledgeable folks on these topics. So having said all that, I'm very excited for the discussion presentation today. I will pass it over to Liz and Marla to get started.
Great, thanks. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today, both to be doing this with Idra, but especially to be talking to a dear friend and really one of my heroes, Liz Vartkessian. Liz has written an amazing book called The Deserving, which is what we're going to be talking about today. I encourage everybody who hasn't read it to go out and get it and read it. It is a compelling, emotional uh, explanation of what it means to do good work in this area and what it means to do mitigation work. And I'm glad that Torrin mentioned that not everybody knows what all of these issues are, because I thought what we might do today to start off before jumping right into the book is to ask Liz if you would start by talking about how and why you got involved in this work known as mitigation, and then we'll talk what mitigation is. But yeah.
Perfect. Marla, thank you so much for doing this with me. You're hero equally of mine. Marla and I, for just to catch everybody up, we've known each other for a long time through the research that we've done on the Capital Jury Project. And in the book, The Deserving, one of the chapters, I do talk a little bit about some of the interviews that I conducted as a researcher with the Capital Jury Project. And so if there's time for us today to talk about any jury research, it's always a topic that I enjoy discussing. And also want to thank Idra for having me. I remember when Idra first started, and it's incredible to me that this community exists. It gives me so much hope. I'm a big believer in rigorous study informing practice, and this organization really speaks to that. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. Mitigation is a weird phrase. When I tell people that I work as a mitigation specialist that are not involved in the law, they think that I do construction or something with waterways, some sort of waste management, perhaps. And even when I say I'm a mitigation specialist to people who are engaged in defense work, it's like not very well known. So how did I get involved in this? Some 20 years ago, I was not gray haired and far more rested. And I decided that I was interested in criminal defense work and specifically work surrounding capital punishment. I wasn't exactly sold on becoming an attorney, and I was curious about whether there were other roles within the defense space that would allow me to engage in the development of information and evidence that could help give context to how a person causes harm. In the book, I talk early on about my own trajectory. Both my parents immigrated to the United States. My mom came from Poland. My father came from Iraq. Both families, my father, ethnic Armenian, had experienced genocides. And so from like a really young age, I had a sense that, really difficult, traumatic experiences kind of seeped into the lives of people. It certainly did into my life, even though there wasn't really any discussion about, these experiences that generations before me had endured. But it was, I think, like that process of existing in a family where things like secrecy was so much a part of the way that I was raised, and not really understanding how people who can view themselves as moral can perpetrate harm against another person or community and still see themselves that way. So when I went to college, I studied philosophy, and I really thought about sort of the moral underpinnings of legal systems. And that led me to look at comparative social policy, where I looked at how other nations structure their criminal legal systems. And then that led me to the death penalty. And like most people who started this work some 20 years ago, there wasn't a degree. There still isn't a degree that one can get to do it. And that's, I would say, by design. We don't want there to be a degree for a mitigation specialist because it's a multidisciplinary profession. People come from social work, from philosophy, ethnography, anthropology, and it was always designed to be that way. But because of that, I really fell into it. I had met an attorney when I was in college. I did some volunteering for her. As it turned out, she knew a person who knew a person who knew a person who had started a nonprofit. I reached out to that individual. She had opened a nonprofit in Houston, Texas in the early 2000s. Houston, Texas at the time was the epicenter of capital punishment. I said, I will move to Texas. And she said, well, you should just show up when you can. And so for people who are too young to know what Craigslist is, it's like kind of like Facebook Marketplace. Bought a car on Craigslist, drove from Washington, D.C. to Texas, and that's where I began. And I learned there, like, how do you excavate information that could be relevant to somebody's potential life and liberty being taken away. And I'm happy to sort of get into with you, Marla, like what mitigation is within the law and like how one practices it, but I can take a pause here if there's another question that you have.
Well, I'm just wondering how you went from, getting a car on Craigslist, driving across the country, going to Texas, to now being at ARC. Like
Yeah,
there's a huge
there's a
jump
lot.
there. There's a lot
There's
there.
a
So
lot.
if you could just talk
There's a lot.
about that a little
Yeah.
bit, and then yeah.
Yeah. And so Marla just mentioned the nonprofit that I'm the director of that I founded about 12 years ago. It's called Advancing Real Change. So I start working as a mitigation specialist in the early 2000s in Texas at a time when Texas is executing somebody about once every 2 weeks, and people are being sentenced to death in the state roughly at the same pace. And so I learned very early on that the best way to get my clients to safety was to do a very thorough investigation prior to the trial taking place. And what I discovered, because we were doing both pretrial and post-conviction cases in Texas, was that all the people who had voted for sentences of death for our clients, many of whom I interviewed as a mitigation specialist, they weren't given the sort of detailed generational context that is necessary to inform jurors when they are being asked to make this really incredible decision. So I'm in Texas for a few years learning how to do this. I understand the value and the capacity for mitigation to ease retributive responses to crime. Because we'll talk a little bit about what mitigation is and what it's not, but at its core, mitigation is about connection. It's about helping people see somebody else as fully human. It's about ensuring that their dignity is intact in a process that is really designed to strip a person of dignity. So I was learning all these things, and then I went off to do jury research with the Capital Jury Project. I continued to work on cases, but in the back of my mind, I always understood that there needed to be a place where people could come and really learn the best practices of how to develop and find this evidence and to present it to decision makers. And so about 12 years ago, I started advancing real change with the hope that we would be an organization that could provide a lot of training and support to people who wanted to learn how to do this, and that we could be a part of educating judges, prosecutors, the public at large, to the fact that our clients, I don't run an innocence project, so most of our clients are people for whom there is considerable evidence to convict them, that our clients have most often caused terrible harms, and yet they're also loving fathers, teachers for their friends. They care about the people around them, that human beings are complicated and complex, and that you don't just take away the horrible thing that a person has done when you take away their life, right? I say in the book that my first boss really taught me that when we ask a jury to make a decision about life and death, or we ask judges to determine whether somebody is irredeemable and should spend the rest of their days incarcerated, we're allowing the system to push aside all the ways in which this person is valued and loved and essential to so many other people. And it also pushes to the side the role that we play sort of collectively in creating conditions where people don't have the opportunity to flourish, don't have access to the kind of supports that they need. So that's why I started advancing real change. And that's kind of how I get from Nissan Sentra off of Craigslist to where I am now.
That's how you get there. But before we talk specifically about what mitigation is and what mitigation is not, can you talk, just give a plug for ARC? I mean, it was your goals, but what is it exactly that you all do?
Yeah. So we do direct casework in capital and in non-capital cases. So as members of criminal defense teams, we work collaboratively with the lawyers, fact investigators, paralegals to gather information that really anchors our clients at the center of the case. And I don't want to talk about mitigation as being sentencing evidence, because it's not. So often I think, as mitigation has become a more commonly used phrase, there's this notion that mitigation is just connected to sentencing, but mitigation is actually really understanding how the individual client understands and perceives the world, right? So one example that I use is I worked on a case in Connecticut a couple years ago. It was a non-death penalty case. The state of Connecticut doesn't have the death penalty. My client was close to 30 years old when he was convicted of a murder and sentenced to 80 years. And the lawyers representing him came to me to help with a clemency petition. And he was factually innocent. So this is one of the cases where I happened to have a client who was innocent. That's not why I chose the case, but I was interested in doing the clemency work on a case like his, because as many people here probably know, one of the ways in which you get clemency is to apologize, right? To atone. And this creates a real dilemma for people who are factually innocent. And I like a challenge. So I thought, yeah, I'd like to work on that clemency petition to see how we do this. And in the process of gathering the materials that the lawyers had, I asked them whether they had any of the client's school records. Like, do you have his school records? Do you have his medical records? What about his parents and his siblings? And they were like, no, we've been representing him for 20 years. We don't have any of that stuff. We didn't think it was relevant. So I set out to go ahead and get these documents. The thing is with my client, whose name is Adam, and he's given me permission to speak about his case publicly, he had put himself in the area of the murder. When the police picked him up and took him to the station, he said that he was a few blocks away. He thought he was doing himself a service by saying exactly where he was. And then in the intervening years, he made other statements which contradicted the first statement that he had made. So most people who hear that think Adam is a liar. Adam's trying to get out of a situation. And that's exactly like what a prosecutor said, right? All these statements were contradictory. He's lying. Well, I got his school records and I saw immediately that he had a serious learning disability. He was in special education, and there were notes from as early as the age of 6 where teachers were saying that under pressure, he would just kind of say things that were inaccurate. He had a bad memory, that he was very eager to please, right? So you could see how getting these records immediately have a way of understanding all of these statements that have nothing to do with sentencing, right? It has everything to do with the client's ability to withstand custodial interrogations or questioning, right? So that's the work that we do, is we work in non-capital and capital cases to really understand the totality of how our clients come into contact with the system, whether they're an innocent person or not, and then to think about the connective factors between the client, judges, juries, community members, that people should be aware of before they make decisions about what's going to happen to the person long term. So we do that. We have an office in Baltimore. We have an office in Jacksonville, Florida. We have an office now in Birmingham, Alabama. And then another part of the work that we do is a huge amount of training and education. So those are the two biggest, I would say, programming areas for us: our direct casework and training and education.
Great. Um, so can you tell us a little bit about what compelled you to write this book and to write it now?
Yeah. So I it was a really tough decision to write this book, and I say that very early on. I didn't come to the relationships that I talk about in this book with the idea that I would be speaking about them. But I don't know if people on the call have had experiences where you just kind of like can't, like, you see things so clearly as researchers, and I'd like to include myself in the community of researchers, but we see these consistencies so frequently. And sometimes it can be overwhelming to see in black and white the truth of a topic, and to not sort of shout it from the rooftop. So my moment of that was during the pandemic, during the first Trump administration. I had a client who was one of the 13 individuals who was executed. His name was Wes Perky. He was the second man executed of the 13 people that Trump executed in his first term. And I talk about this at the end of the book, just the experience of working on Wes's case and the things that I learned. But to your question, the most important thing for people to know is that in order to carry out an execution, there has to be a legal document. It's called a death warrant. And this is something that is, signed by a judge, right? That provides the state the legal mechanism to carry out an execution. Most death warrants expire at midnight. And so if the client is still alive at midnight, the execution doesn't go forward. Wes was set to be executed on July 15th. And at midnight, he and I were on the phone. And because it was the pandemic, I couldn't be with him. And he had several stays in federal courts that were intact. And so, I believed, like all my other clients who had made it past midnight, that Wes was going to be okay. But as it turned out, under the Trump administration, the Attorney General thought that notice of execution was sufficient by email. And so we received an email a couple hours after midnight saying that the government decided they were still going to proceed with the execution. And Wes was killed sometime in the morning of July 16th. And up until that point, I had really thought that, we were all sort of acting in good faith, and that the rules mattered. Even if I didn't agree with what the government was trying to do, that I had never actually seen, the government behave so flagrantly lawless. And it was too much. I just couldn't take it. I couldn't bear it anymore. I couldn't bear that Wes's death was going to happen this way. I couldn't bear the fact that the Attorney General and the President of the United States were saying that these executions were going forward because the victims needed closure. When I had a relationship with the victim's mother, who told me that nobody called her to ask her if she could even come to the execution, and that she couldn't make it, and she would have wanted to be there for her daughter, but she was vulnerable to COVID. It was just all of the ways in which I felt like I, I just couldn't hold on to the untruth of so much of what was happening. And I became a parent also. I had my first child about a week and a half before Wes was executed. And I think it was, all of those things happening. The pandemic, becoming a parent, not being able to be with Wes at the end, watching the government break its own rules to seek his death. I felt like I had to say something.
And say something you did. Did you have a specific audience in mind or a specific goal of what you wanted to accomplish with the book?
I really wrote it almost like, yes, and I wrote it in stages. So the early chapters I feel like are for this community in particular, academics, researchers, people who are really interested in thinking about policy. I outline, what mitigation is, how we got here. In my heart, I hope that judges and prosecutors will see it so they can better understand what a mitigation specialist is asked to do. But I'm also writing for a general audience because of the reason I was prompted to write in the first place. I really wanted to connect with as many people outside of criminal defense spaces so they would know what was happening. In particular, I was very interested in general audience readers who view themselves as interested in criminal justice reform, but perhaps not reforms that would extend to people who are guilty of committing terrible crimes. Because I believe it is in that space that we really need to be thinking about what our policies, rules, and beliefs are. Because if you can't give it to everybody, then it's not real, is how I feel about it. And I think that watching how Wes was killed really brought that home to me, is that everybody needs to be able to access the same protection, not just the people that we think are deserving of a life.
It's interesting because you right there used the title of your book, The People Who Are Deserving of a Life. So is that how you came to decide on the title for your book?
So I will be honest, I had a really good editor who asked me what I thought of the deserving, and I thought, man, this is a really good editor. I don't know that I would have come up with this myself, but it feels exactly right. And so my editor suggested it, and it felt perfect because in my mind it encapsulates so much of what the book hopes to achieve, which is to have people meet my clients as human beings first, and to learn about their crimes after they get to know something about them, and to see what that does to how they view the crimes that my clients are convicted of having carried out. I don't often read reviews of the book. I try not to because I feel like this is it's a very personal book. I don't know that I'll ever write one again. And I really tried to write a book that I could sort of leave it all on the floor. And so reading reviews can be challenging, but some of my favorite reviews that I read are when people say things like, I don't know what to think after having read this. And that's my hope, right? Is that the messy complicatedness that I feel every single day as I carry out my work is also something that a reader will feel. That there isn't a black and white, good and evil, like that things are way more complicated than that. And the second you begin to start wading into the spaces of context and understanding connection and how a human being isn't solely responsible for their own development, right? Like we understand that many of the decisions that are the most impactive on the development of a human being are decisions that other people have made for us. And yet the truth of that often doesn't extend to my clients and their behaviors, and understanding how they are still people worth mercy and the opportunity to atone, to grow, and to redeem. Um, so the deserving really felt like it was just so much a part of what I was trying to convey about my clients, about our society collectively, about what each of us deserves. I have a chapter in the book where I talk about victims. I think there are so many opportunities for us to be doing better for everybody. And that's what, the title, I hope, conveys to people who pick it up.
Okay. When I think about traditional forms of research, I think of, quantitative versus qualitative, inductive, deductive, etc. Your work is obviously grounded in the evidence. Could you talk a little bit about your process of conducting the research for the book?
Yeah, so the research for the book was really the work that I did as a mitigation specialist on specific cases. And as a mitigation specialist, the work that I do in a particular case is 3 generations at a minimum of I do 3 generations at a minimum of investigation because there are so many forces that shape an individual's life that they might not have direct knowledge of. So I have to cast a wide enough net to kind of be able to see patterns or absences of support. Just, I think about Ernest Hemingway. If you look at his family tree and you look at the people who attempted to take their lives or people who suffered from alcoholism, right? Like you see these collections within trees. And so that's the beginning is 3 generations. It's all of the paper and it's all of the people. So it operates on 2 tracks. I'm collecting as many documents as I can: education, social services, medical, mental health, incarceration, employment, military service, like you name the institution that a human being may have come into contact with, immigration enforcement, right? Like I'm getting every document that I can for each one of those individuals, my client, his or her parents, their siblings, aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents, right? So easily 40 or 50 people are the 3 generations of record collection. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to spend time with as many people as I can find who are biologically related to my client, who have lived with my client, who had any potential to observe my client. So school teachers, classmates, people who they worship with at the mosque or at a church, at a temple, people who they played sports with, coworkers. Like, and again, I go through this list in the book where I talk, in great detail, but it's easily many thousands of hours of document collection in archives. I'm looking at old newspapers to get a sense of what was being said about communities, because neighborhoods are a big part of how my clients, how each one of us have been formed and shaped. So I'm looking at, where the dump sites are, if there are toxins that my clients and their families and community members have been exposed to. I'm looking at things like, when did emergency services come to the area? Because for so many of my clients, emergency services didn't come until much later. I'm looking at the installation of sewage systems and things of that nature to understand what type of investments were given to this community. So I'm doing this just huge amount of like social, psychological, biological, and spiritual research to understand all the forces that can shape a life and move a person in different ways. So it's a huge amount of like deep research focused on building context.
So one of the themes that comes through very clearly from your book, and you've touched on it here, is that it takes time to develop the trust and the relationships and to gather the evidence and information necessary to truly understand the individuals and your clients. And yet, most cases in our criminal justice system and our legal system are not processed in a way that allows for that. And yes, you focus primarily on capital or LWOP cases, et cetera. But can you speak to the ability or the necessity, perhaps, of having mitigation work in non-capital cases in your quote, daily cases and ways in which the defense community might be able to incorporate some of these principles?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I do, the book purposefully looks at cases where there's enough of, there's enough material to bring a reader through, but mitigation is in my view, there will be a time when access to mitigation investigation becomes synonymous with access to justice, because really what it does is it places the individual at the center of the decision making process that is happening sort of all around them. And so in robbery, burglary, sexual assault cases, right? Like looking at a piece of three generations. You may not be doing all cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, extended family, but if you could go to a courthouse and just get the criminal, civil, and traffic records of the client, parents, and grandparents, you will start to see certain like things that are popping up consistently or perhaps inconsistently, which is meaningful. If that can be done for school records, again, just a couple, generations for school records, that's extremely informative. Mental health, again. So there are ways to kind of focus and to, just as a starting point, gather more information to build out context. Oftentimes people will say to me, well, there's like literally no way where I can do all of this. Yeah. And what's interesting is that I believe that to a certain extent, mitigation will be the undoing of the system that we have. Because the courts have said mitigation in certain cases is required. And if you bring it out to its logical extension, like the more this becomes required, the slower and the more impact it has on resources in the system. The system can't accommodate so many people being a part of the system without expanding even more. And like it just won't, it's not sustainable. So a part of the work that I do is to educate courts about the resources that are required to do this, right? That if you say you want context, context means that I'm giving you reliable information, and reliability is enhanced by being able, right, to have information coming from more than just one source. I can't reliably just focus on what my client says because he or she may not be the most accurate reporter. I need additional information to give reliable information so people can make the best decisions. And so if we're all trying to obtain reliable information, then the system needs to provide some of those resources. The more resources that are provided, the slower things can go, the fewer cases can go forward, and you can kind of get a sense of, the view that I hold, which is eventually this becomes synonymous with justice. And this is one of the ways in which mass incarceration shrinks because the system just can't continue to process as much if you were actually trying to build some kind of context for all the cases.
So you mentioned in that response that one of the things you try to do is to educate the courts on the necessity of this kind of information. So what would be your recommendations or suggestions to people to do the same in their local jurisdictions of like how could what's the kind of evidence that might convince stakeholders of the importance of doing this work and allowing the time and resources for it?
We spend an enormous amount of money on so many things. And I say this not in a political way, but we're spending a lot of money on a war right now. We've spent a lot of money on other types of interventions or policies where it is uncertain what the larger public good will be. And yet, when it comes to investing early on in doing an investigation that will provide context, it's as if none of that matters. So, like, I feel like we have a little bit of a blank check to pursue like harmful policies, but not the same blank check to pursue things that could assist us. So, what would I say to a decision maker? I would say, one of the things that mitigation seeks to do, especially in non-capital cases, especially in cases where our clients, could be diverted from the criminal justice system, is to really understand the moments in their life prior to them coming into contact with the system and the kind of support they needed to have gone a different way. Right, to build very clear, very specific, highly individualized plans for how to ensure that they're going to be successful in their reintegration in the community, right? And it's not just the first few months, because we know that the first 180 days are the hardest for people when they are coming out of prison or if they're moving back into the community, right? So what are the supports? If we use my client Adam as an example, right, knowing the fact that he had these learning difficulties immediately says to me that I'm going to need to get some really strong support for him to find employment, right? That I'm going to need to make sure he's got a social worker who can help him fill out rental applications, because he, you know what I mean? Like, it speaks to the everyday functioning of a person to understand the context and their history and to know what kind of support they needed to be able to flourish and to do better. And so you can spend the money earlier on, hire a mitigation specialist and allow them the opportunity to help build that context so decision makers have what they need to make the best choice for this individual. Or you can hope that the person somehow is able to extract themselves from whatever the forces were that, sort of led to them being in the situation. Um, but that usually like doesn't work out. So I would demonstrate like all the ways in which it facilitates better decision making and increases public safety. I mean, I am a big believer that we all deserve to live in safe environments. And I believe that when you understand somebody's context, you are far more able to give them the support that they need so they can be most successful in the community.
So some of what you're talking about seems to mesh with these ideas of holistic defense. Can you talk
Mhm.
a little bit about how mitigation fits into that model?
Right, absolutely. And so mitigation, I think, and this is where as holistic defense has continued to grow, they kind of get like mushed together, right? And so holistic defense is not mitigation and vice versa, but they're definitely components of mitigation. Like, so this idea that context matters to reentry planning is a huge part, I would say, of holistic defense, that you're working as a team, that teams are better able to work alongside, and that the client is a part of the team as well. The client has agency and a voice, right? These are all very much components of the mitigation work that I learned to do and that I continue to carry out. I think where some of the differences lie, though, is that mitigation is not focused on things like a diagnosis. Really, we are looking to give as much rich narrative context specific to the person and not to diagnose, not to sort of minimize or flatten what the client's experience was like. We do work very collaboratively, and I know that a lot of holistic defense units are attempting or have adopted this, but I think the challenges that I've seen for some holistic defense units is that to really truly work collaboratively is not to say you've got 6 weeks to write a sentencing report, right? It is to be a part of the process of thinking about the litigation, the strategy, thinking about how we're learning things about the client's behavior and capacity and what that means for what the lawyers are going to do. An example that I give oftentimes would be, if I discover that a client has disability that has been noted in Social Security records, in school records, in any kind of record, are we litigating for accommodations? Accommodations both for the ways in which we might be visiting with our clients, right? Jails often want to keep me behind glass. They want to limit the time that I have with my clients. Well, if I have a client with a disability, how are we using the Americans with Disabilities Act to litigate those issues? My client needs more time. My client needs more breaks, right? Like, so I'm thinking about what does this mean for the way we represent our client, and how does that impact the way we talk about our client in our motions, the way we talk about our client's behavior in public to the court. So mitigation is broader, right? Oftentimes, and I think holistic defense sort of has taken on for people who are coming from mitigation. And also it's, again, multidisciplinary, right? So I think holistic defense, it's more often than not a social work role. But because mitigation is not, it's informed by social work, but it is not social work, that is also a big difference between it.
Can you speak a bit about the role of team dynamics and how mitigation specialists, when it works well, when it doesn't, and some potential reasons as to why?
It's really hard. I think I didn't go to law school in the United States, but I know a lot of lawyers and I've spent a good amount of time in those spaces. And I think legal education has come so far since the last 20 years. But I think for a long time, legal education really focused on preparing lawyers to act like singularly and not really think about the fact that they are going to be project managers a lot of the time, right? So if you're working on a team and you are, the quote unquote lead attorney, so much of your job ends up being project management. You cannot carry out all the functions, but you need to ensure all the functions are being carried out, which means you need to know enough about what people are supposed to be doing in order to be an effective project manager. And those are hard skills, like they're real skills, and nobody's teaching folks who are coming out of law school or schools of criminal justice typically, right? Like, how do you manage massive projects with huge amounts of data? I'm sure people here know that feeling very well, right? You've got a volume of data that you're trying to understand and multiple people working on a project, and the stakes are very, very high. That's the other thing, is because the stakes are so high, I think that people are scared. I think that, in the criminal defense community, and I talk about this in the book, in my early days as a mitigation specialist, the way I saw my colleagues deal with loss, not just of execution, but when a client gets sentenced to life without parole, right? In our adversarial system, life without parole is often considered a win when the death penalty is involved. And I can tell you that every single client that I have who's serving life without parole, it is devastating, right? Like, I understand that it was the better outcome, but it is not a satisfactory outcome. So I'm watching people around me in my early 20s, and what are they doing? They're drinking a lot. They're using street drugs. They're, living dangerously, like taking risks. I knew a lot of wonderful attorneys who died by suicide, and it's the same, like helping professions, emergency room surgeons, homicide detectives, right? These really high rates of just lots of challenges, right? Because you're interfacing with so much trauma. So you're thinking about all that, right? You're thinking about the fact that people are coming into this work and they didn't learn the skills that are necessary to sort of manage it, both from a project perspective and a personal perspective. And the stakes are so high and everybody is scared. So things can go sideways very quickly. So you need people on your teams who are good at communicating. You need people on your teams who are able to extend grace to one another, right? I think about the times when I haven't shown up well as a team member, and I really try to not do that. We talk in the capital defense community in particular about what we call team splitting, which is something that we say our clients will do. Team splitting is to sort of portray things as black and white, develop a relationship with one person, and to kind of, negotiate like relationships within the team, prefer somebody else over somebody else, right? And it can create a lot of problems. Well, I've noticed a lot of defense teams operate this way too. And so when I see myself having the need to have a side conversation on a team, I don't do it, right? Like, because I understand that that's not good behavior. But there's so many things about this work that make it so challenging, make it so fraught. And the thing that I hope the most is that the more conversations we have about how to be good to one another within teams, the better the team structure becomes. But it really also comes, I would say, from whatever the leadership is on the team as well, because I can, do everything that I have learned how to do, but ultimately, if I am getting shut down, I can't force people to do different, right? So if there are any lawyers here, please don't shut people down. It's important, right? It's really important in order for people to stay doing high quality criminal defense work. We need people to make space and to be kind. And that's a huge component of why some teams are successful and some teams are not.
Um, so what kinds of evidence do you think that this group that is so focused on doing research, what kinds
Yes.
of evidence do you think that they should be looking for or collecting that would be most beneficial and helpful to this idea of mitigation in the indigent defense systems?
I think, so something that my organization, we look at and we deal with quite a bit, first of all, is like incentives, right? So I think about how people become qualified to take on cases as an attorney. I'll use the example of Florida. So we have an office in Florida. The federal government has these procedures about opting in to speed up the time it takes from conviction to execution. And Florida applied to be a part of the opt-in process. And my organization wrote a comment about how Florida is not actually qualified to move faster. And part of that was to talk about the incentives for how lawyers become death qualified attorneys in the state. So in the state of Florida, in order to represent somebody who's facing a capital sentence, you have to have gone through capital trials twice to sentencing through sentencing. Now, it might seem like on its face like that's a really good idea, except for the fact that most of the time, if somebody's going to a capital trial, they're gonna get a death sentence. So conventionally, right, like the way to get your client to the safest place is to negotiate a settlement that doesn't include a death sentence and avoid a trial. So incentivizing going to trial actually is the opposite. Like the lawyers who are some of the best capital defenders have rarely gone to trial. Maybe they've gone to trial twice in like 30 years, right? Like they are constantly settling cases without going to trial. So I think about researching incentives around that. California is another great example. There are a lot of incentives to get people to go to trial. So lawyers are paid a lot more per day for being in court versus the hourly rate that they get paid when they're not in court. And so that incentivizes private practitioners to be in courtrooms in capital and other high stakes cases, right? So I think about money a lot. I think about what resources are doing, how it incentivizes behavior. I would love to see as much research around that as possible. And then I think also, like your earlier question, Marla, in our discussion around what does mitigation get you? It gets you so much, right? And there have been some studies that demonstrate, you do a robust mitigation investigation, and what you get is not a death sentence, not a sentence of life without parole, which, both of those sentences are very taxing on the criminal justice system, right? You get things that are less financially taxing. And I would love to see more research around demonstrating what the savings, because so oftentimes policymakers are rightly interested and concerned about budgets, the savings that one can obtain if you avoid these extremely long punitive sentences. I believe research demonstrates that, really a sentence over 25 years is not a sentence in advance of public safety, right? And if you look at mitigation in non-death penalty cases, and you can sort of connect in my mind how those help reduce sentences. And also, I'd love to see studies about people who have come out and the ways in which the mitigation investigation has helped them return to the community successfully. I think all of that would be tremendously valuable to the work that I am doing every single day, trying to help more judges, prosecutors, community members understand the value of this beyond the human right value, but that there is a lot of policy and financial value to having mitigation be a part of the process as early on as possible, and in far less severe cases.
I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking we've got some questions that have come up as well. But I'm wondering,
Great.
before I turn it over to Torrin to ask whatever questions have come up, I'm just wondering if there's anything that you wish, to address, or topics that we didn't touch on from your experience, the writing of the book, your work with ARC, anything else that you would like, themes that you would like to share.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a tough question. I mean, just based on this audience, I will say this. I started Advancing Real Change as a place where people could come and learn to do mitigation. And part of that was because I would be contacted to work on a case. I was in private practice before I started the nonprofit. And I, was turning down cases often because a caseload for me is like 2 or 3 cases. So we have guidelines. The American Bar Association gives professional standards for how one is supposed to do mitigation to carry out the work. And the guidelines say your caseload should reflect your ability to provide high quality work to your client. And so for me, that's always been like 2 or 3 cases, not more than that. So if you think about all the potential capital cases pre-trial, right? Like Miami-Dade County right now has like 200 pre-trial capital cases. That's one county in Florida. So let's just say there are 10,000 potential death penalty cases pre-trial, right? And then every stage of appeal, you get a new mitigation specialist and a new team. So for your state process and your federal process, you need mitigation specialists for those. And that's just the capital cases. That's not any of the JLWOP. It's none of the second look cases that are now exploding all around the country, which is beautiful. It's none of the clemency. It's none of the parole, right? Like mitigation is a part of all of those things. So I could find lawyers to take those cases that I've just named, really good ones who would take those cases pro bono. I cannot even find a mitigation specialist to recommend. There are so few mitigation specialists in the country. And that's the other reason why I was sort of moved to write the book at this point. I am eager and hoping that the book will make it into spaces where people who are interested, like I was, in doing really human to human proximate work with people who are engaged in the criminal legal process and don't want to be attorneys, that this could be their profession, and that you don't need to take on hundreds of thousands of dollars, that you could be a philosophy major and you could choose to do this work, and that it is valuable, it is essential, and that if people can continue to sort of spread the word that this exists, hopefully we can keep building a bench for the future of mitigation. So that would be my ask of people here, is share and share widely that this beautiful profession exists, and that it's magic. This work is the best thing that I could ever have hoped for.
Wow.
Thank you very much. There are some questions that I will bring up from the chat. And I would also encourage anyone, if you want to ask a question, you can type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. And if you have asked a question and you would like to kind of converse about it, please feel free to just raise your hand. Bob asks, can you give examples of where you have been appointed to defense teams, or are you independently funded?
So all of the cases that I have worked on come from court appointments, or we work with public defender offices who engage our services on cases where they don't have in-house mitigation specialists but need mitigation, or they do have in-house mitigators, but they haven't, but they're minding their caseloads correctly and need additional support. The only other way that I've worked on cases, or that my nonprofit does, is if a law firm takes a case pro bono, and we provide services in that instance. But most of the time, even in those instances, we're often still appointed by courts, though not all the time. And I've worked in almost every federal circuit. I've worked, I mean, you name the state, like we've done work there. So we get appointed all over the place. And sometimes it is a lot of education, right? And especially in the non-capital cases, like we have a non-capital case in Virginia, we had to do a lot of education around the need for it. In that case, we've done some federal drug cases that are more complicated. And, even though in the federal system, like mitigation is requested, you don't always get a mitigation specialist. And so there have been, times where we really had to like help our attorney colleagues advocate to get the resources. We've done, we work all over the place. So.
Jasmine asks, how do you bridge the gap in perception that mitigation/social work has, and the perspective of the court systems, especially in states/communities that have more traditionally conservative views on criminality as a moral failing?
Mm-hmm. I discovered at some point that whether I wanted to be or not, like I'm a storyteller. And I think that we didn't get to this with much depth, but I suggested that mitigation is about human connection. So the statutes that exist really focus on things like trauma, difficulty, difference, culpability. But those are not reasons why people extend a second chance or mercy. The reasons, and I've learned this through the Capital Jury Project research that I did with Marla, that people do is because they recognize love of a person. And I know that that sounds soft and strange, but I'll tell you that I've been doing this work for over 20 years and it's true, right? And so whatever is true for my client, like that is how I talk about it. If my client has experienced trauma and difficulty, we talk about those things. But it's not the event itself. It's what the event has done to the client's ability to be the best version of themselves. So I give this example. I went to college. I went to George Washington, which is in Washington, D.C. And I was there when 9/11 happened. And I saw the Pentagon, up in smoke, and it was very scary. And, I went on with my life, got a therapist, worked it out. I don't feel like I carry any long-term challenges based on having lived in the area. Um, it's not mitigating that I was living in Washington, D.C. when 9/11 happened because it didn't impact my trajectory in any discernible way. Mitigation is what happens in the spaces of experience. And it could be positive, it could be challenging, right? But it's the whole picture of understanding the ways in which a person is shaped and formed and moved. And so when we practice in very conservative jurisdictions. We have an office in Alabama and in Florida, right? We had 10 federal cases under Trump during his first term. We were in front of every attorney general that he had. None of our clients were even authorized for to have the federal government pursue sentences of death. So the things that I'm saying might sound like they're not going to matter, but I truly believe that if a person has ears to hear, they have a heart to be moved, and that we actually just have to tell the true stories of the ways in which our clients have been impacted and the value and potential that they have to change. Mitigation so often reminds people of the things that they know are true, but like we forget, like childhood matters. Like people know that, right? So how are we connecting those experiences to the decision makers? I spend a lot of time researching the people in the community who are going to be hearing the narratives, hearing the history, hearing the potential about my client in order to help sort of focus, right, the things that we're talking about because they will resonate. So I think about oftentimes elected prosecutors will talk about how victims of child sex abuse need protection. Well, guess what? Most of my clients have been victims of child sex abuse and they needed that protection, right? So there are ways to connect the experiences of the clients to the things that people know really do matter. Yes, children who have had that experience, they need protection. And so did my client. And you understand that because that's what you're saying and that's what you're running on. So why not have that be a part of the calculus here, right? Because fundamentally we understand it. So really thinking about how do we make connections with people so it is harder for them to stay in that lane of people are inherently broken, evil, different, right? That's not true. We know that that's not true.
Thank you. There's a couple more things. In the interest of time, I'll kind of speed through and or combine. From Matthew, just wanted to kind of mirror what you were saying earlier as someone that worked as a victims advocate and now is on the defense side. That essentially there's a lot of work to be done in improving the process from both sides.
Yeah.
And then Bob had a follow up on if you had any example education materials in terms of uh, helping lawyers get appointed. And then I'll rope in this other one because it's also a request for materials, which is, do you have an example of a mitigation report that you can share?
Yeah, we have so on ARC's website, advancingrealchange.org, we have a resource library. And if you go to you have to sign up for it. It's free. All of the education that we provide is free. But you do have to sign up. It's password protected. And we have templates, samples, and it's searchable by keyword. So if you go to our website, request access to the library, do a search for, we call them mitigation submissions. I think that we have a few that are redacted up there or that we've changed enough to shield the identity of the person. And if for some reason it's not up there, you're welcome to email me and I can get some samples. And the same would go for materials that we provide or use to support attorneys getting appointed to cases or mitigation specialists appointed to cases.
So I've just linked in the chat advancedchange.org.
Oh,
That's right, correct?
yeah.
It has your book on the cover, so I assumed that was
Yeah,
right.
that's where we're at.
Yeah. And then I believe your email is also available in the announcement.
Yeah.
We are pretty much at time. I definitely do want to give either of you a chance to say anything final if you would like, or if you feel like we're ready to go.
I
Oh,
don't
I'm
think I
just
could
so
add anything to what Liz has said. So
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Marla.
Liz.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for doing this. Thank you.
Yeah,
And thank you, Torin. Thank you,
yeah.
everybody, for being here. And please do, if there's anything that I can do to support the work that you all are doing, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will be slow to respond, but I promise I do respond. And I really do. If there's something I can do, please let me know.
Yes, thank you to both of you, and
Thank you.
thank you to everyone who came. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the presenters, and if you're not sure how, feel free to reach out to me. I'm emailing the listserv, once a week at least, so you can reply to any of those, and I can get you in touch with any of the presenters or any of the information. So
That's my email.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you again.
Thank you.
If you are new to IDRA, indigentdefenseresearch.org, check us out there. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank
Okay.
you all again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.